We are in Tübingen today.
Tübingen is where everything started. We are back to the roots. In 2017, we started inventing a sign base, and here we are back in 2026. And we are going to the Schloss Museum at the Castle of Tübingen, revisiting the famous figurines from the Swabian Jura.
Welcome to Stone Age Science. We are scientists investigating information encoding from the earliest science in the Paleolithic to the modern day information age. We take you with us on our journey to museums and universities, examining the mobile artifacts in their originals to understand the science of the Stone Age. When modern humans first made their way into the Levant and then via the Balkan route into Central Europe, they ended up, believe it or not, in the Swabian Alps. For example, in the Geisenklösterle cave, which has as its first and earliest layer of modern human occupation a date of around 43,000 years ago. Geisenklösterle is in the same valley, the Ach Valley, as the Hohlefels cave, and they are only around 2.5 kilometers away from one another. Then there is another valley, the Lohne Valley, with another 2 caves, and this is maybe a day trip for a hunter-gatherer tribe away, namely around 37 kilometers. Here we have the Hohenstein-Stadelhöhle, where the famous lion human was found, and from Hohenstein-Stadel it's another maybe 2 kilometers to the Vogelherd cave. The Swabian Alps is a beautiful area to live in nowadays, with apple orchards and lush foothills. And you can imagine that despite the fact that the climate was certainly quite a bit colder 40,000 years ago, you can see why modern humans would settle down here. One of the major universities in the area is the University of Tübingen. This is where the excavators of the Swabian Aurignacian, like Robert Rudolf Schmidt in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Gustav Rieck, Joachim Hahn, and nowadays Nicholas Conrad, held their professorships. The institute is in the castle Hohen-Tübingen. And this is also where Eva finished her PhD on the markings, the abstract signs of the finds from the Swabian Aurignacian. We visited Eva's old office and we met with her good friend and colleague, Dr. Sibylle Wolf. She is the scientific coordinator of the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and a researcher at the Institute. In Eva's old office, you can still find some of the antler pieces she used to understand how marks can be applied to this material, also in the case of ivory.
So here we have a huge chunk of mammoth ivory. This is a fragment of a mammoth tusk, and you see the typical growing structure of ivory. Here, obviously, because it's so old, the circles are already cracked. This is the outer side of the tusk. And here inside you see how the growing functions. So it's like ice cones pushing from here, and these are the oldest ones, these are the youngest ones. And this is the material in which many of the objects that we study is made from.
While Eva studied the markings on these ivory figurines, Sibylle Wolf is an expert on the beads that were made, so the jewelry that was made from ivory, and we wanted to pick our brains to what extent this also tells us something about communication.
Can you tell me what are good archaeological examples for standardized communication in the Paleolithic?
Key elements, key artifacts are personal ornaments. Because we are personal ornaments, you communicate to the outer world, to your opposite, to the partners, and in the same group, you can assume that the people understand the meaning of the respective personal ornament elements. In the Swabian Aurignacian, we have formed the so-called double perforated ivory bead that lasts for a minimum of 6 millennia. This is a form that occurs in the oldest Aurignacian layers, for example in Hohlefeld's cave, but also in the nearby Geistklösterle cave.
Which is also the sites that we are working on for the markings. So we have the same sites, the same archaeological layers. Could you explain us a little bit more about the personal ornaments themselves and what makes them so special for communication, besides that other people have to understand it? Why do you think this is so important for communication?
The double perforated ivory bead is a means of group communication because you find it at several cave sites in the Aare and the Lone Valley, but not outside this geographical region. And so that the people had different patterns, how that they suit these personal ornaments on their clothing in different patterns, and that not only the form itself but also the pattern conveyed a specific message that then the other people of the group understood. And we also have, for example, here the toggle-shaped rounded perforated bead, and this also occurs oftentimes, but in comparison with the double perforated ivory bead, it's the number is less, much less. And we see also trends. This here is a globular bead, similar to a basket-shaped bead in France. This only occurs in the younger Aurignacian layers. So we have trends. We really have trends in the upper Paleolithic of southwestern Germany of bead forms already in the Aurignacian. And this, for example, was probably an ornament that was just one ornament
like a highlight
on a chain, a highlight.
Yeah.
While the double perforated bead is not a single highlight. This is due to pattern, while this here is an individual signature. But the group signature is much more important. If we're talking about communication systems, we talk about communication as soon as we talk about ornaments. But the communication system is really clear. We can really clearly see with a double perforated bead.
What you thought when you first saw this figurine?
Yes, I remember very well. Many years ago, it was, I think, even before I started studying prehistory, I came here and visited the museum. And what was so striking is the small size of these objects. Usually you see them in photographs or posters or something, and they appear huge, and then you see how tiny they are. They fit in a palm, and imagining people carving with such a precision at this small size is even more impressive for me personally than looking on a huge sculpture. one of the first figurines that have been discovered from the Swabian Jura. It's a mammoth figurine excavated in the 1930s by Gustav Rieck. And it's very impressive because it encapsulates the form of a mammoth very well. It's around, I think, almost 4 centimeters long, and it has a thick belly, and all the features of the animal are very well represented. And when you look closely, you see there are markings all over the animal. So you see the shoulder area, the belly area. There are markings on the head, on the side of the head. There are markings where the tail starts. Also on the other side of the animal, we see in symmetric order rows of crosses, and there are rows of crosses on the belly. So all over you find some markings on this mammoth figurine.
There are around 30 figurines which are very famous, but there are in fact hundreds of further artifacts such as tools, pieces of flutes, and these bear markings which in some cases are probably indices that were used for working these pieces, but in other cases there is no straightforward utilitarian explanation for them. And based on Eva's first-hand analyses of this material from the Swabian Aurignacian, we have now published our first article of the Evine project. Humans 40,000 years ago developed a system of conventional signs. And now I want to walk you through the 3 major findings of this article. The first major finding of this article is that when we analyze these sign sequences of the Paleolithic and we compare them to modern day written languages around the world, we can clearly see a noticeable difference in the classification algorithms. Now you might say, okay, Chris, but this is a straw man, right? I can look at these sequences and see that it's not like modern day writing. However, if you want to prove this strictly according to standard information theory, it is extremely hard, if not impossible. Why? Because the sounds of spoken language, the sounds that you hear while I speak, are recoded on my computer into ones and zeros and then sent over the internet to your computer. And there they are decoded and rendered as sounds. So it is possible to recode spoken language into sequences of just ones and zeros, which are fairly repetitive because you only use 2 signs. So the straw man might actually come to hunt you if you really want to prove that this is not a recoding of spoken language. What we have shown is, let's say, a lighter version of a proof, which is a statistical tendency that the sign sequences of the Paleolithic have very different structural properties from what we have in modern day writing. So I would say this is a necessary condition for writing, which does not seem to be met in these early sign systems. The second major finding, and this is the one that really surprised me, is that the Paleolithic sign sequences are very close, in fact indistinguishable in terms of their statistical features from the earliest proto-cuneiform periods. Here we used as a comparative sample the so-called Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative data, and here we used the earliest periods of proto-cuneiform. These are called Uruk, from Uruk 5 to Uruk 3. And when we look at the earliest period of these, the Uruk 5 period, and when we look at the sign sequences of this period, they are indistinguishable from what we have 35,000, 40,000 years earlier in the Paleolithic, in the Swabian Aurignacian. I remember when I first had this result on the screen, these statistical results, I thought, okay, you must have messed something up here. The pre-processing must be somehow wrong, because I had in my mind that the proto-cuneiform periods have to be very close to modern day writing, but they are not. In other words, for 40,000 years, nothing seems to have really changed at least according to these samples that we use now. But then within a couple hundred years, we suddenly have the bootstrapping of a genuine writing system with higher information density, higher entropy, and lower repetition rates. So this is, to me, an extremely surprising result. The third major finding of our study is that the signs of the Swabian Aurignacian, they were not just randomly applied to the objects, but certain objects, for instance, figurines of animals and humans, were chosen to carry sequences of high information density. For instance, on the right arm of the female figurine from Hohlefels, there is a whole sequence of different signs, not repetitive signs, always the same signs, but different signs in adjacency. So figurines tend to have sequences of relatively high information density, tools tend to have sequences of somewhat lower information density, and other types of artifacts, for instance, musical instruments like flutes, tend to have some of the lowest density in terms of the sequences of signs. So this is why we argue that this is a system of signs and a conventional system of signs, because you wouldn't get these statistical patterns if people had just randomly applied sign sequences to these artifacts. They have chosen certain sign types and they have chosen certain artifacts to come together. Now, I also don't want to conceal some of the differences between the proto-cuneiform material and the material from the Swabian Aurignacian. Firstly, in the case of proto-cuneiform, we have these later systems that help us to trace back what the original meanings also of the earliest periods were. In the case of the Swabian Aurignacian, we don't have these subsequent sign systems developing out of it that we could use to trace back their meanings. They are in a vacuum. The meanings are forever lost to us. The world of these people, the thoughts they had, the cultures, the myths they were telling each other. This is forever lost to us because it's so deep in time and it's so far removed from us, also culturally. And the second difference is that in the case of proto-cuneiform, within only a couple hundred years, the system exploded into an extremely information-dense system, eventually also reflecting the Sumerian spoken language. In the case of Aurignacian sign sequences, they seem to be stable in terms of information density for 10,000 years. And if you think about it, 10,000 years, that is all of written history and even more. In the case of the Swabian Aurignacian, this culture seems to have been stable, and also the signs have been stable for 10,000 years. And then the climate changes, the area becomes colder and eventually uninhabitable for modern humans. So they leave and they take the culture and their signs with them.